Because she wanted a yoga room, my daughter-in-law kicked me out into a blizzard. We need space. Go to a shelter. My son just looked down in shame. They had no idea I had just inherited a $50 million estate from a long-lost uncle. I left crying, but the next morning I bought their apartment complex with cash. I returned as their new landlord and made their lives a living hell. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my own son would watch as his wife threw me out into a blizzard. But that's exactly what happened on that bitter December evening when the snow was falling so hard you couldn't see 3 feet in front of you. I had arrived at Winston's apartment that Friday afternoon with my old leather suitcase, the same one I'd been using for 20 years. The brown handles were worn smooth from my grip, and the corners were scuffed from being placed on countless floors of bus stations and cheap motels during the lean years when I was raising Winston alone. I'd called ahead, like I always did, to make sure it was okay to visit for the weekend. "Of course, Mom," Winston had said, though his voice lacked the warmth it once held. "Aviana's got some yoga thing going on, but we'll make it work." The apartment smelled like sandalwood incense when I walked in, that cloying, sweet scent that always made my nose itch. Aviana was in the living room, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect messy bun, wearing those expensive workout clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She was arranging meditation cushions on the hardwood floor, her movements precise and deliberate. "Oh," she said when she saw me, not bothering to hide the annoyance in her voice. "You're here." I forced a smile, the same one I'd been wearing around her for the past 4 years since she married my son. "Hello, Aviana. How are you, dear?" She didn't answer, just continued moving her cushions around like I wasn't there. Winston appeared from the kitchen, his hair thinning more than I remembered, wearing a button-down shirt that looked expensive, but somehow made him look smaller than he used to. "Hey, Mom," he said, giving me a quick, awkward hug. "How was the bus ride?" "Fine, sweetheart. Thank you for letting me stay the weekend." I glanced around the apartment, noting how everything had changed since my last visit 3 months ago. The walls, once a warm cream color, had been painted stark white. The comfortable old couch where Winston and I used to watch movies was gone, replaced by a sleek gray sectional that looked like it belonged in a doctor's waiting room. "Where should I put my things?" I asked, already knowing the answer would somehow be complicated. Aviana straightened up from her cushions, her green eyes sharp with irritation. "That's actually something we need to talk about." Winston shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I could see the muscles in his jaw working, the way they used to when he was a little boy trying not to cry. "The thing is, Mom," Aviana continued, her voice taking on that fake sweet tone she used when she was about to say something cruel, "I've been working really hard on building my yoga practice. I've got clients coming for private sessions, and I need the space to be perfect." I nodded slowly, not understanding where this was going, but feeling the familiar knot forming in my stomach that always appeared when Aviana started talking. "The guest room," she said, gesturing toward the small bedroom where I always stayed. "It has the best natural light in the apartment. I really need it for my yoga studio." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I looked at Winston, waiting for him to say something, anything, to defend me or offer an alternative. But he just stood there, staring at his expensive leather shoes, saying nothing. "I see," I said quietly. "Well, perhaps I could sleep on the couch? I don't mind, really." Aviana let out a short laugh. "Oh, that won't work either. I have early morning sessions starting at 6 a.m. I can't have someone sleeping in the living room." Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows. I could hear the weather reporter on their muted television talking about the approaching storm, his hands gesturing at a map covered in angry red and white swirls. "Maybe there's a hotel nearby," I suggested, though I knew my monthly budget of $840 from Social Security wouldn't easily cover an unexpected hotel stay in this expensive neighborhood. "Actually," Aviana said, her voice brightening with false enthusiasm. There's a really nice shelter downtown. I read an article about it in the newspaper. They serve hot meals and everything. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. A shelter? It's supposed to be quite clean, she continued, as if she were recommending a restaurant. And they have beds, real beds, not just cots. I turned to Winston, my heart breaking as I watched my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died, the child I'd worked double shifts to put through college, stand there and say absolutely nothing. Winston? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind outside. He finally looked up, his brown eyes, my eyes, filled with something that might have been shame. But instead of speaking up for me, instead of telling his wife that throwing his 64-year-old mother out into a blizzard was unthinkable, he just shrugged. Maybe it would be better, Mom, he said, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. Just for tonight. Until we can figure something else out. I felt something die inside my chest at that moment. Not break, die. This wasn't my son anymore. This wasn't the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, or the teenager who promised he'd always take care of me when he grew up. This was a stranger wearing Winston's face, parroting words his wife had put in his mouth. I see, I said again, my voice surprisingly steady. I picked up my old suitcase, the weight of it familiar and somehow comforting in this moment of complete bewilderment. Aviana was already moving toward the door, eager to get me out before the storm got worse and made her look even more heartless than she already did. The shelter's on 5th Street, she called over her shoulder. You can't miss it. As I walked toward the door, I caught a glimpse of mail scattered on the kitchen counter. Bills, I noticed, several of them marked with red lettering. For just a moment, I saw Aviana glance nervously at the pile, before quickly shuffling them out of sight. Mom, Winston called as I reached for the doorknob. I turned back, hope fluttering in my chest that he might have found his spine, that he might finally stand up to his wife and tell her this was wrong. Instead, he handed me a $20 bill. For a cab, he said, not meeting my eyes. I stared at the crumpled bill in his palm, remembering all the times I'd given him my last $20 when he was in college, all the meals I'd skipped so he could eat, all the nights I'd worked cleaning offices while he slept safely in his bed. Keep it, I said quietly, and walked out into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall. The snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see the streetlights, and the wind was driving the flakes horizontal, stinging my face and seeping through my old wool coat. I pulled my knitted hat down over my ears and started walking, not sure where I was going, but knowing I couldn't stand on their doorstep. My thin boots, bought from a discount store 2 years ago, were not made for this weather. Within minutes, I could feel the cold wetness seeping through to my socks. Each step was treacherous on the icy sidewalk, and I had to stop every few yards to wipe the snow from my glasses. I thought about the shelter Aviana had mentioned so casually, as if suggesting I spend the night with homeless strangers was perfectly reasonable. The shame burned in my chest, mixing with the cold to create a pain I'd never felt before. How had I raised a son who could watch his wife treat me this way? After walking for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, I found myself standing in front of a 24-hour diner. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting pink light on the snow-covered sidewalk. Through the steamed-up windows, I could see a few customers hunched over coffee cups, refugees from the storm like me. I pushed through the glass door, grateful for the blast of warm air that greeted me. The waitress, a woman about my age with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looked up from wiping down tables. "Rough night to be out," she said, her voice kind. "Yes," I managed, my voice cracking slightly. "It certainly is." I slid into a booth near the window and ordered coffee and pie, partly because I was hungry, but mostly because I needed somewhere warm to sit and think. The coffee was bitter and strong, and the apple pie was clearly from a package, but it was warm and sweet and reminded me of better times. As I sat there, watching the snow pile up on the window ledge, my phone buzzed in my purse. For one foolish moment, I thought it might be Winston calling to apologize, to tell me to come back, that he'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, it was a number I didn't recognize. The warmth of the diner felt like a mockery now, artificial and temporary. Outside, the storm was getting worse, and I was 64 years old with nowhere to go, and a son who had chosen his wife's yoga studio over his own mother's basic human dignity. I answered the phone with trembling fingers, not knowing that this call would change everything. The coffee in my hands had grown cold while I stared out at the storm, my mind drifting back to a different winter night, 23 years ago. Winston was 14 then, and we were living in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment above Murphy's Bakery on the south side of town. The heat had been turned off because I was 3 weeks behind on the gas bill, and we were huddled together on the couch under every blanket we owned, watching our breath form clouds in the frigid air. "Mom, are you cold?" Winston had asked, his voice muffled by the scarf I'd wrapped around his neck. "No, baby," I'd lied, pulling him closer. "I'm fine as long as you're warm." That night, I'd waited until he fell asleep, then slipped out into the snow wearing my waitress uniform and walked 6 blocks to Murphy's, where I worked the overnight shift cleaning the bakery equipment. My hands were so numb I could barely hold the scrub brush, but I earned $35 that night, enough to get the heat turned back on the next day. Winston never knew about those overnight shifts. He never knew about the nights I cleaned office buildings downtown while he slept, or the mornings I came home exhausted and made him breakfast with a smile on my face like I'd had a full night's rest. He never knew that I sold my wedding ring, the only thing of value I had left from his father, to buy him a computer for school when he was 16. All he knew was that somehow, we always managed. Somehow, there was always food on the table and heat in the apartment and money for his school supplies. Somehow, his mother always found a way. I used to be proud of that. I used to think I was teaching him something valuable about resilience and determination. I never imagined I was teaching him to take my sacrifices for granted. The diner bell chimed as another customer pushed through the door, bringing a swirl of snow with them. I watched them stamp their feet and shake off their coat, grateful for shelter from the storm. And I wondered if Winston ever thought about those nights when I was his shelter, when I stood between him and every hardship life tried to throw at us. After his father died in that car accident, people told me I should consider giving Winston up for adoption. "You're so young," they said. "You could start over, meet someone else, have a real life." But Winston was my real life. He was 5 years old with his father's stubborn chin and my brown eyes, and he needed me. So I kept him, and I worked, and I sacrificed, and I never once regretted it. Not until tonight. My phone buzzed again, still showing that unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail, not ready to deal with whatever telemarketer or wrong number was trying to reach me. I had bigger problems than someone trying to sell me a new credit card or extended warranty on a car I didn't own. The truth was, I'd seen this coming for years. Winston had started changing the moment he met Aviana at that yoga retreat in Colorado 5 years ago. She was everything I wasn't: young, blonde, confident, and from a family with money. Her father was a doctor. Her mother was a real estate agent who drove a Mercedes and wore jewelry that cost more than I made in a year. The first time Winston brought her home, I tried so hard to make a good impression. I cleaned the apartment until it sparkled, bought groceries with money I'd been saving for new winter boots, and cooked a dinner that took me 2 days to plan and prepare. Aviana had picked at her food, made polite conversation for exactly 23 minutes, then announced she had a headache and needed to leave. "She's just nervous," Winston had said later when I asked if I'd done something wrong. "She wants you to like her." But I could see it in her eyes during those 23 minutes. She was cataloging everything: my discount store clothes, my secondhand furniture, my small apartment with its thin walls and dated kitchen. She was calculating my worth, and I came up short. Still, I tried. For 3 years while they dated, I tried. I sent birthday cards and holiday gifts I couldn't afford. I complimented her yoga teaching and her healthy lifestyle choices. I bit my tongue when she made little comments about my apartment being cozy or my cooking being interesting. I smiled and nodded and played the role of the grateful mother-in-law-to-be who was so lucky to have such a wonderful woman love her son. The wedding was small and expensive, held at a boutique hotel in downtown. I wore a dress I'd bought at Goodwill and had altered to fit, and I watched my son marry this woman who I knew in my heart would never love him the way I did. During the reception, Aviana's mother made a point of telling me how lucky I was to have such a successful daughter-in-law, as if Winston was somehow marrying up by association. After the wedding, the changes started slowly. First, Winston stopped calling as often. Then, he stopped coming to visit my apartment, claiming it was too far from their place, even though it was only 40 minutes by bus. Then came the suggestions that I should visit them instead, but only with advance notice, and only when it was convenient for Aviana's schedule. Gradually, I became a guest in my son's life, instead of a permanent fixture. And the worst part was, he seemed fine with it. He seemed almost relieved to have someone else making the decisions about when and how often he had to deal with his mother. The last time I'd felt truly welcome in Winston's presence was 2 years ago, during a family barbecue at Aviana's parents' house. Their backyard was beautiful, professionally landscaped with a stone patio and an outdoor kitchen that probably cost more than I'd ever made in a single year. I was sitting at the far end of the table, trying to make conversation with Aviana's aunt, when I overheard Winston talking to Aviana's father. "The thing about my mom," Winston was saying, "is that she never really had any ambition, you know. She was content just working those little jobs and raising me. She never wanted more for herself." I'd felt something twist in my chest hearing those words. Never wanted more? I'd wanted everything: college, a career, travel, love, a second chance at happiness. I'd wanted 1,000 things I never got because I was too busy wanting things for him instead. But sitting in this diner now, with snow piling up outside and nowhere to go, I finally understood something I'd been too blind to see for years. Winston didn't remember my sacrifices as love. He remembered them as my job. In his mind, I wasn't a woman who had given up everything for him. I was simply a mother who had done what mothers do. And now that he had a wife to take care of him, my services were no longer required. My phone buzzed a third time, and this time I decided to answer it. Maybe it was someone calling about a job, or a neighbor who'd seen the news about the storm and was checking on elderly residents. At this point, any human contact felt better than sitting alone with my bitter thoughts. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse from fighting back tears. "Is this Rosalind Mitchell?" The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Rosalind." "Ms. Mitchell, this is Marcus Webb from Webb, Harrison and Associates. I'm an estate attorney and I've been trying to reach you regarding your Uncle Harold." I frowned, struggling to place the name. "Harold?" "Harold Mitchell, your father's brother. I understand you might not have had much contact with him in recent years." Uncle Harold. I had a vague memory of him from when I was very young. A tall, thin man who lived alone in a big house outside the city and rarely came to family gatherings. My father had mentioned him occasionally over the years, usually to complain that Harold was getting stranger as he aged and had more money than sense. "I'm afraid I have some sad news," Mr. Webb continued. "Your uncle passed away 3 weeks ago. But I also have some rather significant news. You've been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate." I nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry. What?" "I know this must come as a surprise. Mr. Mitchell left very specific instructions about locating you and ensuring you received your inheritance. The estate is quite substantial." The diner seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the table with my free hand, trying to process what I was hearing. "How substantial?" I whispered. "$50 million, Ms. Mitchell." The words didn't make sense. They seemed to float in the air between me and the phone like something from a dream. $50 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like something you'd hear on the news about lottery winners or tech billionaires, not something that could possibly apply to a woman sitting alone in a diner during a snowstorm with $23 in her purse. I don't understand, I managed. We barely knew each other. According to the letter he left, he'd been following your life from a distance for years. He knew about your husband's death, about raising your son alone, about your struggles. He was very specific about wanting his money to go to someone in the family who had shown real character. Character? I almost laughed at the irony. An hour ago, I'd been thrown out into a blizzard by my own child. How was that for character? Ms. Mitchell, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. We'll need to meet as soon as possible to begin the transfer process. There are quite a few legal documents to sign, and given the size of the estate, there are some tax implications to discuss. Would Monday morning work for you? Monday morning, 3 days from now. 3 days to go from being a woman with nowhere to sleep tonight to being a millionaire. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. Yes, I heard myself say. Monday morning would be fine. After he gave me the address of his office and we hung up, I sat staring at my phone in complete shock. Around me, the diner continued its normal nighttime rhythm. The waitress refilling coffee cups, the cook flipping burgers, the other customers bent over their newspapers and late dinners. None of them had any idea that the woman in the corner booth had just become one of the wealthiest people in the city. $50 million. The number kept repeating in my mind, but it felt surreal, like something that was happening to someone else. I thought about Winston and Aviana, warm and comfortable in their apartment that they could barely afford, arranging meditation cushions and planning yoga sessions while I sat here in the storm they'd thrown me into. They had no idea what they'd just done. They had no idea that the mother they'd discarded like an old piece of furniture, the woman they'd sent to a homeless shelter because she was inconvenient, was now richer than they could ever dream of being. For the first time in hours, I smiled. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, as if the weekend's blizzard had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the bruises on my heart were still tender as I sat in the leather chair across from Marcus Webb's mahogany desk, staring at documents that would change my life forever. The law office occupied the entire 23rd floor of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Everything in the room spoke of old money and established power. The Persian rugs, the oil paintings of stern-faced judges, the crystal decanters filled with amber liquid that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Marcus Webb was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from handling other people's fortunes for decades. He'd spent the past hour walking me through the inheritance paperwork, explaining trust funds and tax shelters and investment portfolios with the patience of someone who understood that $50 million was an incomprehensible sum to a woman who'd been living on Social Security. The house alone is worth $12 million, he was saying, sliding another photograph across the desk. Uncle Harold's estate was a sprawling Victorian mansion on 15 acres just outside the city limits, complete with gardens, a carriage house, and what appeared to be a small lake. He lived there alone for the past 30 years, but it's been meticulously maintained. I studied the photograph, trying to reconcile this palatial home with my vague memories of my eccentric uncle. I had no idea he was wealthy. Your uncle was a very private man. He made his fortune in real estate development back in the 70s and 80s, then essentially became a recluse. No wife, no children, very few social connections. Marcus leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. But he did keep track of his family, particularly you. He knew about your struggles after your husband died, about how you raised Winston alone. He was quite specific in his letter about wanting his wealth to go to someone who had shown real sacrifice and character. The word character stung, given how I'd been treated just 3 nights ago. But I pushed the thought aside and focused on the paperwork in front of me. Character or not, I was now a very wealthy woman, and I needed to start thinking like one. "There is one thing I wanted to discuss with you," Marcus said, pulling out another folder. "Given your new financial situation, you might want to consider making some changes to your living arrangements and lifestyle. Have you given any thought to where you'd like to live?" I had given it thought, actually. I'd spent most of Sunday in a modest hotel room, paid for with some of the advance money Marcus had arranged, thinking about my future. But first, I had some unfinished business to attend to. "I'll need to stay in the city for now," I said. "There are some matters I need to handle." Marcus nodded and handed me a business card. "This is Sarah Chen, a private investigator I sometimes work with. Very discreet, very thorough. Given your new wealth, you might want to have her do some background checking on the people in your life. Unfortunately, money has a way of bringing out the worst in people, even family members." I took the card, though I didn't tell Marcus that my family had already shown me their worst without knowing about the money. "Thank you. I think that's a very good idea." After leaving the law office, I spent the afternoon in my new reality. I opened accounts at 3 different banks, each requiring multiple forms of identification and verification calls to Marcus's office. I bought new clothes, not expensive designer pieces, but quality items that fit properly and didn't scream discount store. I purchased a reliable car, nothing flashy, just a dependable sedan that would start every time and keep me warm in winter. But more importantly, I called Sarah Chen. We met at a coffee shop near her office, a sleek woman in her 40s with an MBA from Northwestern and 15 years of experience in corporate investigation. I told her what I needed: a complete financial background check on my son and daughter-in-law. "Most people want to know about assets," she said, taking notes in a leather portfolio. "You want to know about debts?" "I want to know about everything, but yes, especially debts." Sarah's report came back 2 days later, and it was even worse than I'd suspected. Winston and Aviana owed $87,000 in credit card debt, spread across 11 different accounts. Their mortgage was 3 months behind, totaling $9,600 in missed payments. Aviana's yoga business was failing. She'd lost her lease on the downtown studio 6 months ago because she couldn't make the rent, and now she was trying to run private classes out of their apartment to generate income. Even that wasn't working. She had only 4 regular clients, and one of them had recently complained about noise from the neighbors and was threatening to find another instructor. Winston had been laid off from his marketing job 8 months ago and hadn't told anyone, including me. He'd been living off unemployment benefits and the occasional freelance project, but even the unemployment was about to run out. They were 2 weeks away from eviction proceedings on their apartment, and Aviana's car was about to be repossessed. As I read through Sarah's report, sitting in the living room of my new hotel suite, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me was shocked by the scope of their financial crisis. These were not small problems or temporary setbacks. Winston and Aviana were drowning. But another part of me, a part I wasn't entirely proud of, felt a cold satisfaction. They'd thrown me out into a blizzard because they needed space for yoga classes that weren't making money anyway. They'd sent me to a homeless shelter because I was inconvenient, because I represented the kind of poverty and struggle they were trying so hard to pretend they'd escaped. They had no idea how close they were to losing everything. I spent that evening walking through the neighborhood where Winston and Aviana lived, studying the area with new eyes. It was a gentrified district full of converted warehouses and trendy restaurants, the kind of place where young professionals went to feel sophisticated and urban. The apartments were expensive, but not particularly well built, and the whole area had that slightly desperate feeling of people trying very hard to appear successful. Their building was a converted textile factory, red brick with large windows and a modern glass entrance that was supposed to look industrial chic. According to Sarah's report, the building had 24 units and had been struggling financially since the developers had overestimated the rental market. Half the units were currently empty, and the management company was behind on maintenance and building improvements. I stood across the street, looking up at what I now knew was Winston and Aviana's 4th-floor apartment. I could see lights on in their windows, probably Aviana practicing her yoga routines, or Winston sending out more job applications that would likely go unanswered. They were up there right now, probably arguing about money, blaming each other for their problems, never imagining that the solution to all their troubles was standing on the sidewalk below, the solution they'd rejected and humiliated just 1 week ago. The next morning, I called Marcus Webb. "I want to buy a building," I told him. "Certainly. What kind of property interests you? Residential, commercial, investment property?" "The Riverside Lofts on 4th Street. I want you to find out who owns it and make an offer." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Any particular reason for that building?" "I believe it has potential." It took Marcus 3 days to track down the ownership structure and negotiate a deal. The building was owned by a small real estate investment group that had been trying to unload it for months. They were so eager to sell that they accepted my offer of $12 million without even trying to negotiate. By Friday afternoon, I was the new owner of the building where my son lived. Winston and Aviana had no idea, of course. The sale was handled through a shell company that Marcus had set up, and the management would remain the same for now. As far as my tenants knew, nothing had changed, but everything had changed. I spent that weekend in my hotel suite planning. I had Sarah pull the rental agreements and lease terms for all the units in the building. I studied the maintenance records and building expenses. I reviewed local rental rates and building codes. I was no longer just a heartbroken mother who'd been cruelly rejected. I was a businesswoman with $50 million and a very specific problem to solve. The problem was that my son and his wife had forgotten how to treat people with basic human decency. They'd become so focused on their own wants and needs that they'd lost sight of fundamental values like respect, gratitude, and compassion. They needed to be reminded of these values, and since they'd shown no inclination to learn them on their own, I was going to provide some educational opportunities. On Monday morning, I met with the building's management company. I told them I wanted to implement some improvements to increase the property value and rental income. I authorized a complete renovation of the building's common areas, starting with the lobby and mailroom. I approved new security measures, including cameras and a more sophisticated entry system. I signed off on landscaping improvements and exterior cleaning. All of these changes were perfectly reasonable for a new owner who wanted to improve their investment. The fact that they would also give me detailed information about the comings and goings of my tenants was simply a convenient side effect. I also approved some policy changes. The management company would now be much more strict about lease enforcement. Late rent payments would result in immediate notices. Noise complaints would be taken seriously and documented. Violations of building rules, like using common areas for unauthorized business purposes, would result in warnings and potential fines. These policies would apply to all tenants equally, of course. I wasn't targeting anyone specifically. I was simply ensuring that my building was run professionally and that all residents followed the same rules. The fact that these rules might be particularly challenging for tenants who were already struggling financially, or who were trying to run yoga businesses out of apartments that were zoned for residential use only, was simply a matter of coincidence. By the end of that first week as a property owner, I had learned several interesting things. Winston left the building every morning at 8:30, dressed in a suit as if he were going to work, but according to the doorman, he usually returned by noon with coffee and a newspaper. Aviana had clients coming to the apartment for yoga sessions, which was technically a violation of both the lease agreement and the building's residential zoning. They'd had 3 noise complaints from neighbors in the past month, and their rent was now 12 days overdue. I sat in my hotel suite that Friday evening, reading through the management reports, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not revenge. I told myself it wasn't revenge. This was simply education. Winston and Aviana needed to learn some important lessons about consequences, about how their actions affected other people, about what happened when you treated others with cruelty and disrespect. I was simply providing them with a learning environment. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Winston's number. I stared at the phone for several rings. then let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, I played the message back. "Mom?" His voice sounded strained, worried. I wanted to check on you. Make sure you were okay after that storm last week. I know things got a little heated, and Aviana feels bad about how everything went down. Maybe we could get together for coffee or something. Talk things through?" I deleted the message without calling back. The education had begun. 3 weeks had passed since I'd become the anonymous owner of the Riverside Lofts, and the changes were already beginning to show. What Winston and Aviana didn't know was that their new landlord was watching every move they made, documenting every rule violation, and slowly tightening the screws on their comfortable little world. I'd established a routine of visiting the building twice a week, always in my new car with tinted windows, always at different times of day. I told myself I was simply monitoring my investment, ensuring the management company was doing their job properly. But the truth was more complicated than that. I was studying Winston and Aviana the way a scientist studies lab rats, observing their behavior as their environment became increasingly hostile. The first major change had been the rent increase. As the new owner, I was within my rights to raise rents to market rate when leases came up for renewal. Winston and Aviana's lease was month to month, which meant I could implement changes with 30 days' notice. Their rent went from $3,200 to $4,800 per month, effective immediately. The notice had been delivered by registered mail on a Tuesday morning. I knew because I'd been parked across the street, watching through binoculars as Aviana signed for the envelope. Even from a distance, I could see her face change as she read the contents. She'd stood in the lobby for several minutes, reading the notice over and over as if the words might somehow change. That afternoon, she'd stormed into the management office, demanding to speak with someone in authority. I'd received a detailed report from the property manager within hours. "The tenant in 4B is very upset about the rent increase," Cheryl Martinez had told me over the phone. Cheryl was a professional property manager in her 50s who'd been handling difficult tenants for decades. She claims they can't afford the new rate and wants to negotiate. "What's the current market rate for similar units in the neighborhood?" I'd asked, though I already knew the answer. $4,800 is actually below market. Similar units are going for $5,000 to $5,500. Then we're being very reasonable. Did she indicate whether they plan to sign a new lease or vacate? She asked for 2 weeks to consider their options. I'd given them the 2 weeks, of course. I was nothing if not fair. During those 2 weeks, I'd watched them scramble. Winston had started leaving the building earlier each morning, staying out longer each day, presumably looking for work with increased desperation. Aviana had increased her yoga sessions, trying to pack more clients into their apartment, despite the noise complaints from neighbors. Which brought up the second issue I'd been addressing as their new landlord, the unauthorized business operation. Residential units in the Riverside Lofts were zoned for living, not for commercial activities. Running yoga classes out of an apartment violated both the lease agreement and city zoning laws. As a responsible property owner, I'd felt obligated to address this situation. The first warning notice had been delivered on a Thursday, the same day I'd observed Aviana leading a session with 6 students in their living room. The notice was polite but firm, reminding tenants that commercial activities were prohibited in residential units and that violations could result in lease termination. Aviana had ignored the warning. 3 days later, she'd held another session, this time with 8 participants. The tenant below them, a software engineer named David Park, had filed a formal noise complaint. Then the tenant next door had complained about people congregating in the hallway. Then the elderly woman across the hall had expressed concern about strangers coming and going at all hours. The second warning notice had been more serious, outlining specific lease violations and giving them 72 hours to cease all commercial activities. I'd been particularly pleased with that notice, partly because it was legally airtight, but mostly because I'd written it myself. Cheryl had been surprised when I'd requested to personally draft the tenant correspondence, but I'd explained that as a new property owner, I wanted to establish clear communication standards. She'd been happy to let me handle the administrative details. Reading my own words on official letterhead, knowing that Winston and Aviana were reading them in their apartment while struggling to figure out how to pay their increased rent, had given me a satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. The third change I'd implemented was enhanced security monitoring. As a responsible landlord, I'd installed cameras in all common areas: the lobby, hallways, mailroom, and entrance. The cameras were primarily for security purposes, but they also happened to provide detailed records of tenant activities. For instance, I now knew that Winston was lying about having a job. He left every morning in a suit and tie, but the lobby cameras showed him returning within 2 hours carrying fast food breakfast and newspapers. He spent his days in the apartment, probably sending out resumes and scrolling through job listings while pretending to Aviana that he was employed. I knew that Aviana had only 3 regular yoga clients now, down from the 6 she'd had a month ago. 2 clients had stopped coming after receiving noise complaints from other tenants. One had switched to a different instructor after Aviana had to cancel several sessions due to building maintenance issues. Maintenance issues I'd specifically scheduled during her usual class times. I knew they'd been fighting. The cameras couldn't pick up audio, but body language spoke volumes. I'd watched them argue in the lobby after receiving the rent increase notice. I'd seen Aviana throw what appeared to be bills at Winston in the hallway outside their apartment. I'd observed Winston storming out of the building at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, only to return 3 hours later looking defeated. Most importantly, I knew they were falling behind on everything. Their rent was now 26 days overdue. Their car payment was late. I'd seen the repossession notice taped to their vehicle in the building's parking garage. Aviana had started working at a coffee shop downtown, something she'd apparently tried to hide from her yoga clients by wearing a baseball cap and taking the service elevator. All of this information came to me through perfectly legal and ethical channels. I was simply being a diligent property owner, monitoring my investment, and ensuring my tenants were fulfilling their obligations. The fact that these activities happened to be causing considerable stress for Winston and Aviana was simply a natural consequence of their poor financial planning and dishonest behavior. On a cold Thursday afternoon in early January, I was sitting in my car across from the building when I saw something that made my pulse quicken. A man in a gray suit was posted signs in the lobby. Eviction notices. I waited until he left, then walked into the building as if I were visiting another tenant. The notices were there in black and white. Winston and Aviana had 72 hours to pay their outstanding rent of $9,600 or vacate the premises. $9,600, exactly 2 months' rent at the new rate. I felt a complex mix of emotions as I read their names on the eviction notice. Part of me felt guilty for orchestrating their downfall so methodically, but a larger part of me felt vindicated. This was justice, not revenge. This was what happened when people treated others with cruelty and disrespect. This was what happened when you threw your mother out into a blizzard because she was inconvenient. That evening, my phone rang again. Winston's number. This time, I answered. "Mom?" His voice was shaky, desperate. "Thank God you picked up. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Hello, Winston." My voice was calm, neutral. "Listen, I need to talk to you. Something terrible has happened. Aviana and we're in real trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "Financial trouble. Big financial trouble. We're about to lose our apartment, and I don't know what to do." I let the silence stretch between us, waiting to see what he would say next. "The thing is," he continued, his words coming out in a rush, "our rent got raised, and Aviana's business hit some snags, and I've been having trouble finding work." More silence from me. I wanted to hear how he would ask for help. I wanted to know if he would acknowledge what he'd done to me, or if he would simply expect me to rescue him without any recognition of how he'd treated me. "I was wondering," he said finally, "if maybe you could loan us some money, just temporarily, just until I find a new job and we get back on our feet." "How much money, Winston?" "Well, We need about $10,000 to cover the back rent and late fees. Maybe another $5,000 for other bills. But we'd pay you back, I promise, as soon as things turn around. $15,000. He was asking me for $15,000 just 3 months after his wife had thrown me out into a storm and suggested I stay at a homeless shelter. That's a lot of money, Winston. I know, and I wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate. But Mom, they're going to evict us. We have nowhere else to go. The irony was almost too perfect. 3 months ago, I'd had nowhere to go, and he'd watched his wife send me out into a blizzard. Now he was the one with nowhere to go, calling the mother he'd abandoned to rescue him. Have you tried asking Aviana's parents? I asked. They cut us off. They said we were being financially irresponsible and they weren't going to enable us anymore. So even Aviana's wealthy parents, who'd always looked down on me as poor and unsophisticated, had more sense than to throw good money after bad. They'd recognized that Winston and Aviana's problems weren't temporary setbacks, but the result of fundamental character flaws. I see, I said. And what about your friends? Surely you have friends who could help? Everyone's struggling, Mom. The economy is tough right now. The economy that had been tough for me my entire life. The economy I'd navigated alone while raising him. The economy that had never prevented me from providing for him when he needed me. Winston, I said finally, I need to think about this. It's a lot of money, and I'm on a fixed income. I know, and I'm sorry to put you in this position, but you're the only family I have left. Family. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I was family when he needed money, but I hadn't been family when he'd needed courage to stand up to his wife. I'll call you back, I said, and hung up. I sat in my hotel suite that night, looking out at the city lights, thinking about power and justice, and the strange ways life circles back on itself. Winston had asked me for $15,000, not knowing that I could write him a check for $50 million without affecting my lifestyle at all. But money wasn't the issue. Character was the issue. 3 months ago, when I'd needed shelter from a storm, he'd chosen his wife's yoga studio over my basic human dignity. Now that he needed shelter from the storm of his own making, he expected me to choose his comfort over my own sense of justice. Some lessons I'd learned could only be taught through consequences. I didn't call him back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. 72 hours later, Winston and Aviana were evicted from their apartment, their belongings stacked on the sidewalk like a garage sale nobody wanted to buy. I watched from my car as they loaded what they could fit into their aging sedan, arguing about what to take and what to leave behind. Aviana was crying, probably from frustration and humiliation. Winston looked shell-shocked, like a man who couldn't understand how his life had fallen apart so quickly. As they drove away from the building I now owned, I felt a deep sense of closure. Not satisfaction exactly, but something more profound. Justice, perhaps. Or maybe just the understanding that actions have consequences, even when those consequences take months to unfold. They still didn't know that their mysterious new landlord was the woman they'd thrown out into the snow. They still didn't know that every rule violation and rent increase and policy change had been carefully orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how it felt to be discarded and forgotten. But they were learning something important, that the world could be a cold and unforgiving place when you found yourself with nowhere to go and no one willing to help. It was a lesson I'd hoped never to teach my own child. But some lessons, apparently, could only be learned the hard way. 2 weeks after their eviction, Winston and Aviana were living in a cramped studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant on the other side of town. The smell of fried rice and soy sauce seeped through the floorboards day and night, and the neon sign from the restaurant below cast red and yellow shadows across their walls until 3 a.m. The rent was $800 a month, all they could afford, and the landlord had demanded first month, last month, and a security deposit up front. I knew all of this because I'd been following their situation closely. Not stalking. I wasn't a stalker. I was simply keeping track of former tenants who'd caused problems in my building. It was good business practice to monitor people who'd violated lease agreements in case they tried to rent from me again in the future. At least, that's what I told myself. Sarah Chen, my private investigator, had been providing regular updates on their circumstances. Winston had finally found part-time work at a telemarketing company, making cold calls to sell extended warranties on household appliances. He was earning $12 an hour for 25 hours a week, bringing home roughly $1,200 a month before taxes. It was honest work, but it was also the kind of soul-crushing job that slowly eroded your sense of self-worth with every rejected phone call. Aviana had given up on teaching yoga entirely. The stress of the eviction and their financial collapse had destroyed her confidence, and she'd lost her remaining clients. She was now working full-time at 2 different coffee shops, pulling double shifts 6 days a week just to help cover their basic expenses. Her hands, which used to be soft and manicured for her yoga practice, were now stained with coffee and cracked from constant washing. But what interested me most was how their relationship was deteriorating under the pressure. According to Sarah's surveillance reports, they were fighting constantly. Not just disagreements or heated discussions, but screaming matches that their thin-walled neighbors complained about regularly. Aviana blamed Winston for losing his job and lying about it for months. Winston blamed Aviana for her failed yoga business and her refusal to consider practical career options earlier. Both of them seemed to blame some mysterious conspiracy for their sudden run of bad luck. They'd spent weeks trying to figure out who was behind their eviction. Winston had contacted 3 different lawyers, but none of them had been willing to take their case once they learned the full details. The rent increase had been legal. The eviction notice had been properly served. All building policies had been clearly stated in their lease agreement. They had no legal recourse against their former landlord. Aviana had become obsessed with the idea that someone was deliberately sabotaging them. She'd convinced herself that one of her former yoga clients, probably someone jealous of her success, had somehow bribed their landlord to get them evicted. It was a ridiculous theory with no basis in reality, but it gave her something to focus her anger on besides their own poor choices. Winston, meanwhile, had developed his own conspiracy theory. He believed his former boss had blacklisted him throughout the marketing industry, preventing him from finding decent employment. He'd convinced himself that his unemployment was the result of professional sabotage rather than the simple fact that he'd been laid off during a corporate downsizing and didn't have the skills or experience to compete in a tough job market. Neither of them suspected that their real problem was sitting in a luxury hotel suite across town, monitoring their every move and feeling a complicated mix of satisfaction and guilt about their suffering. The guilt was new, and it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. 3 weeks into their new living situation, Winston called me again. I'd been expecting the call. Sarah had reported that they were already behind on rent at their new place, and their credit cards were maxed out. They were approaching complete financial collapse, and I was still the only person in their lives who might be able to help them. "Mom," he said when I answered, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "I know you're probably busy, but I really need to talk to you." "About what, Winston?" "About everything. About what happened that night with the storm. About how Aviana and I have been struggling. About how I've been a terrible son." The last part caught me off guard. In all his previous calls, Winston had focused on their financial problems without acknowledging the deeper issues between us. This was the first time he'd admitted that our relationship was damaged. "Go on," I said, settling back in my hotel room chair. "I keep thinking about that night," he continued, his voice cracking slightly, "about how we made you leave during the storm. About how scared you must have been, walking around in the snow with nowhere to go." I closed my eyes, remembering the bite of the wind, the feeling of snow soaking through my inadequate boots, the humiliation of being discarded like garbage by my own child. "It was a difficult night," I said quietly. "I should have stood up to Aviana. I should have told her that throwing you out was wrong, that you were welcome in our home no matter what she wanted to do with that stupid room." His voice was getting stronger, more emotional. "I was a coward, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom." For a moment, I felt my resolve waver. This was what I'd wanted to hear for months. Acknowledgement, apology, recognition that he'd failed me as a son. The pain in his voice sounded genuine, and part of me wanted to forgive him immediately, to wire him the money he needed and rebuild our relationship. But then I remembered sitting in that diner, watching the snow pile up outside, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I remembered the casual cruelty in Aviana's voice when she'd suggested I stay at a homeless shelter. I remembered Winston's silence, his refusal to defend me even when his wife was treating me like a burden to be discarded. An apology was a good start, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "I appreciate you saying that, Winston. It means something to hear you acknowledge what happened. I want to make it up to you," he said quickly. "I know things have been bad between us, and I know that's my fault. But maybe we could start over. Maybe you could come visit us in our new place, and we could talk through everything." Visit them in their studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant, where they were struggling to pay $800 a month in rent. Where Aviana was working herself to exhaustion at coffee shops, and Winston was making cold calls for $12 an hour. Where they were fighting constantly and blaming invisible conspiracies for their problems, instead of taking responsibility for their choices. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," I said. "Please, Mom. I know we don't deserve it, but we really need help. Not just money, though we need that too, but family. We need to know that we're not completely alone in this." Alone. The word echoed in my mind, carrying with it all the weight of my own recent loneliness. They were feeling alone now, the same way I'd felt alone walking through that blizzard. The same way I'd felt alone for years while they built their life around Aviana's needs and wants, treating me like an occasional inconvenience rather than a family member. But there was a crucial difference between their loneliness and mine. My loneliness had been imposed on me by their choices. Their loneliness was the result of their own actions, their own cruelty, their own failure to treat others with basic decency and respect. "Winston," I said finally, "do you remember what Aviana said to me that night? Do you remember her exact words?" There was a long pause. She said some things she shouldn't have said. "She told me to go to a homeless shelter. She said there was a nice one downtown, like she was recommending a restaurant." My voice was steady, but I could feel old anger stirring beneath the surface. "And you stood there and let her say it. You let your wife suggest that your 64-year-old mother should spend the night with homeless strangers, rather than inconvenience her yoga practice. I know, and I'm ashamed of it every day. Are you? Or are you ashamed now because you need something from me?" Another long pause. When Winston spoke again, his voice was smaller, more defeated. "Maybe both. I don't know. I just know that I've lost everything, and you're the only person who might still care about me." The honesty in that admission hit me harder than his apology had. Winston had always been good at saying what people wanted to hear, but there was something raw and vulnerable in his voice that suggested he was finally telling the truth about his situation. "Where is Aviana now?" I asked. "At work. She's pulling a double shift at the coffee shop. She won't be home until midnight." "And how is she handling the stress?" Winston let out a bitter laugh. "Not well. She's convinced someone is sabotaging us. She thinks one of her old yoga clients bribed our landlord to get us evicted. She's talking about hiring a private investigator to figure out who's behind all our problems." A private investigator. The irony was almost too much to bear. If Aviana hired someone like Sarah Chen, someone competent and thorough, they might actually discover the truth about who owned their former building. They might trace the shell company back to Marcus Webb's law firm, and from there to me. But they probably couldn't afford a real investigator. They were barely scraping together rent money for a studio apartment above a restaurant. Any private investigator they could afford would likely be incompetent or dishonest, someone who would take their money and provide them with useless theories and false leads. Still, the possibility worried me. I'd been careful to cover my tracks, but I wasn't a criminal mastermind. If someone started digging seriously into the ownership of the Riverside lofts, they might eventually uncover my involvement. "Winston," I said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. What happened to you and Aviana? The rent increase, the eviction, all of it, that wasn't sabotage. That was just business. Sometimes landlords raise rents. Sometimes tenants get evicted for violating their leases. It's not personal, and it's not a conspiracy. It's just what happens when people can't pay their bills." "But everything happened at once," he protested. "The rent increase, the noise complaints, all those building policy changes. It felt like someone was targeting us specifically." Or maybe," I said gently, "it felt that way because you were already in trouble and looking for someone else to blame. Maybe the real problem was that you'd been living beyond your means for months, lying about your employment situation, and running an illegal business out of your apartment." Silence on the other end of the line. When Winston finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're right," he said, "about all of it. We made bad choices and we're paying the price." "Yes, you are." "So what do I do now? How do I fix this?" The question hung between us, heavy with desperation and hope. Winston was asking me to save him, the same way I'd saved him countless times throughout his childhood. But this time was different. This time, saving him would mean rescuing him from consequences he needed to face, lessons he needed to learn about character and responsibility, and treating other people with dignity. "You fix it by learning from it," I said. "You work your jobs, you pay your debts, and you figure out how to rebuild your life based on what you can actually afford, rather than what you want to have. And us? Is there any chance of fixing things between us?" I looked out the window of my hotel room, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Winston was sitting in a cramped studio apartment, probably surrounded by unpaid bills and the smell of fried rice, wondering if he'd destroyed his relationship with his mother permanently. "That depends on you," I said. "On whether you've really learned something from all this, or whether you'll go back to your old ways as soon as things get easier." "I have learned something," he said quickly. "I've learned that family is the most important thing, that treating people badly has consequences, that I need to be a better man." Pretty words, but words were easy. Change was hard. "We'll see," I said, and hung up. The next morning, I received a call from Marcus Webb. "I thought you should know," he said. "Someone has been asking questions about the ownership of the Riverside lofts. Apparently, a young woman came to the city planning office yesterday, trying to find out who bought the building and when." My pulse quickened. "What kind of questions?" "Basic stuff. Purchase date, price, ownership records. All public information, but it suggests someone is starting to investigate the sale." Aviana. She was actually following through on her conspiracy theory, trying to track down the mysterious new landlord who had destroyed her life. And if she kept digging, if she traced the ownership back through the shell company to Marcus's firm and eventually to me, the whole carefully constructed plan could come crashing down. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Nothing dramatic. The legal structures we put in place should hold up under casual scrutiny. But if someone hires a real private investigator, someone with experience in corporate law, they might be able to piece things together." I spent the rest of the day thinking about exposure, about what would happen if Winston and Aviana discovered the truth. Would Winston understand that justice had been served? Would he see the poetic appropriateness of learning about homelessness from the woman he'd sent out into a blizzard? Or would he simply see it as confirmation that the world was out to get him, that his mother was just another person trying to destroy his happiness? Either way, I realized, the time for hiding was coming to an end. Soon, one way or another, Winston would learn the truth about what had happened to his life. And then we would discover whether he'd really learned anything at all. The meeting I'd been both dreading and anticipating finally came 6 weeks later, on a gray March afternoon, when the last of winter's snow was melting into dirty slush on the sidewalks. Marcus Webb had called that morning to inform me that Aviana had indeed hired a private investigator. Not a competent one, thankfully, but someone persistent enough to eventually trace the Riverside Loft's ownership back to my shell company. "She knows," Marcus had said simply. "Maybe not everything, but enough to cause problems. You should probably consider how you want to handle this." I'd known this moment would come eventually. Part of me had even wanted it to come. Living with a secret this large was exhausting, and there was something appealing about the idea of finally confronting Winston and Aviana with the truth about what they'd done and what it had cost them. The call came that afternoon. Winston's number, but when I answered, it was Aviana's voice I heard. "We know it was you," she said without preamble, her voice tight with anger and something that might have been fear. I took a slow breath, settling back in my hotel room chair. After months of watching and planning and orchestrating their downfall from the shadows, it felt strange to be speaking directly to the woman who'd thrown me out into a blizzard. "Hello, Aviana," I said calmly. "What exactly do you think you know?" "Don't play games with us. We know you bought the building. We know you're the reason we got evicted, the reason our lives fell apart. What I don't understand is why. Where are you calling from?" "We're in the lobby of your hotel. We're coming up." The line went dead. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Sure enough, I could see Winston's battered sedan parked in front of the hotel entrance, snow melting off its dirty windshield. Within 10 minutes, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Winston and Aviana stood in the hallway like a pair of refugees from their own life. Winston looked thinner than he had 6 months ago, his face gaunt and his clothes hanging loose on his frame. Aviana looked worse. Her blonde hair was stringy and unwashed. Her expensive yoga clothes had been replaced by cheap jeans and a coffee shop uniform shirt. And her eyes had the hollow, desperate look of someone who'd been pushed past their breaking point. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. They entered my suite slowly, looking around at the luxury accommodations with a mixture of awe and resentment. The room was larger than their current apartment, with a sitting area, a work desk, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Room service had left fresh flowers on the coffee table that morning, and the air smelled like expensive soap and clean linens. "Nice place," Aviana said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Business must be good for someone living on Social Security." I gestured to the sofa. "Please, sit down. We have things to discuss." Winston perched on the edge of the couch like he was ready to run at any moment. Aviana remained standing, her arms crossed, her posture aggressive and defensive at the same time. "How long have you known?" I asked. "About a week," Winston said quietly. "Aviana hired this investigator guy, and he traced the building ownership back through some company to a law firm. When we went to the law firm, they wouldn't tell us anything, but Aviana saw your name on some papers." "I saw more than that," Aviana interjected, her voice rising. "I saw financial records showing you paid $12 million for that building. $12 million. Where the hell did you get $12 million? I walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd lived my entire life, where I'd struggled and sacrificed and raised my son alone, where I'd been discarded like garbage by the very people now demanding explanations from me. "I inherited it," I said simply, "from my Uncle Harold." "Uncle Harold?" Winston's voice was confused. "I barely remember him." "Yes, well, he remembered you. He remembered all of us. He'd been following our family from a distance for years, and when he died, he left everything to me. $50 million, Winston. He left me $50 million because he thought I'd shown character and resilience in raising you alone." The silence that followed was profound. I turned back to face them, watching as they processed this information. Winston's mouth was hanging open slightly. Aviana was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was an alien from another planet. 50 million, Winston whispered. Yes, I became wealthy 3 days after you threw me out into that blizzard. 3 days after your wife suggested I spend the night in a homeless shelter because I was inconvenient to her yoga practice. Aviana's face flushed red. That was just, we were stressed about money, and we needed the space. You were stressed about money, I said, my voice still calm, so you solved the problem by making your stress into someone else's emergency. You took your financial problems and turned them into my housing crisis. We didn't know about the inheritance, Winston said desperately. If we'd known you had money, obviously things would have been different. Would they? I tilted my head, studying his face. You think the problem was that you didn't know I was wealthy? The problem, Winston, was that you knew I was your mother, and you let your wife treat me like trash anyway. It wasn't like that, Aviana protested, but her voice lacked conviction. It was exactly like that. I sat down in the chair across from them, my movements deliberate and controlled. You wanted my room for yoga classes that weren't making money anyway. You wanted me gone so you could pretend your life was more elegant and sophisticated than it actually was. And when I pointed out that there was a blizzard outside, you told me to go to a shelter. We made a mistake, Winston said, his voice cracking. A terrible mistake. But Mom, you destroyed our lives over it. You made us homeless. You ruined Aviana's business. You cost me my relationship with my wife. I didn't destroy anything, I said firmly. I simply stopped enabling you to live beyond your means. Your rent was increased to market rate. Your lease violations were enforced according to building policy. Your eviction was the result of your failure to pay rent, not any action I took against you personally. But you knew what would happen, Aviana said, tears starting to form in her eyes. You knew we couldn't afford the increase. You knew we'd lose everything. Yes, I knew. Just like you knew I had nowhere to go that night when you threw me out. Just like you knew it was dangerous for a 64-year-old woman to be walking around in a blizzard. But you did it anyway because my safety and dignity were less important to you than getting what you wanted. Winston buried his face in his hands. What do you want from us? An apology? Money? What will it take for you to forgive us? I want you to understand, I said. I want you to understand what it feels like to be discarded by people who should love you. I want you to understand what it means to have nowhere to go and no one to help you. I want you to understand that actions have consequences, even when those consequences take months to unfold. We understand, Aviana said quickly. We get it. We learned our lesson. Can't we just move past this? Have you? I looked directly at her. Because 6 months ago, you solved your problems by making them someone else's crisis. And right now, you're trying to solve your problems by making them my responsibility. You're asking me to rescue you from consequences you created, just like you asked me to disappear when I was inconvenient. How exactly is that different? The question hung in the air like smoke. Winston looked up from his hands, his eyes red with exhaustion and defeat. Aviana's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. I don't know, Winston whispered finally. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make things right between us. For the first time since they'd arrived, I felt my anger begin to soften. This wasn't the entitled, self-righteous son who'd watched his wife abuse me 6 months ago. This was a broken man who was finally beginning to understand the weight of his choices. Do you remember, I said quietly, when you were 7 years old and you broke Mrs. Patterson's window with a baseball? Winston nodded slowly. You came home crying, terrified that you were going to get in trouble, and I told you that the only way to make it right was to go to her house, admit what you'd done, and offer to pay for the damage out of your allowance. Do you remember what happened? She forgave me, Winston said. She said accidents happen, and she was proud of me for being honest about it. But you still had to pay for the window. Yes. Because forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences. It means that despite the consequences, the relationship can be repaired. I leaned forward, my voice gentle but firm. I can forgive you, Winston. I want to forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm going to rescue you from learning the lessons you need to learn. So what happens now? Aviana asked, her voice small and scared. Now you rebuild your lives based on what you can actually afford rather than what you want to have. You work your jobs, you pay your debts, and you figure out how to be the kind of people others want to help rather than the kind of people who take advantage of others' generosity. And us? Winston asked. Is there still a chance for us to have a relationship? I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the city where my son was learning hard lessons about character and consequences, where he was discovering what it meant to struggle, to be vulnerable, to need help from others. There's always a chance, I said. But it has to be a real relationship, based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Not a relationship where I'm valued for what I can provide and discarded when I'm inconvenient. How do we prove that to you? Winston asked. I turned back to face them, these two broken people who'd spent months learning what I'd known my entire life, that the world could be cold and unforgiving when you had nowhere to turn and no one willing to help. You don't prove it to me, I said. You prove it to yourselves. You become the kind of people who deserve forgiveness, who deserve help, who deserve love. And maybe someday, if you succeed, we can try again. Winston stood up slowly, his movements those of a much older man. Will you keep in touch? Let us know how you're doing. I'll think about it. Aviana, who'd been silent for several minutes, suddenly spoke up. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry for what I said that night. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I was awful and I know it. And I don't have any excuse except that I was selfish and cruel and I thought I was better than you. It was the first genuine apology I'd received from either of them. Not an apology designed to get something from me, but an acknowledgement of real wrongdoing and genuine remorse. Thank you, I said. That means something. They left a few minutes later, walking slowly toward the elevator like two people carrying invisible weights. I watched from my window as they climbed into their battered sedan and drove away, probably back to their studio apartment above the Chinese restaurant where they'd spend the evening figuring out how to rebuild their lives from scratch. I felt lighter than I had in months, not because I'd gotten revenge. Revenge would have been cold and empty. This felt like something more meaningful. Justice, perhaps. Or maybe just the restoration of natural order. Winston and Aviana had learned what it meant to be vulnerable and powerless. They'd learned that actions have consequences. They'd learned that the people you hurt today might be the people you need help from tomorrow. Whether they'd learned these lessons permanently remained to be seen. People have a remarkable capacity for forgetting hard-won wisdom when life gets easier again. But for now, at least, they understood something about character and consequences that they'd been missing their entire lives. The next morning, I called Marcus Webb and instructed him to begin the process of transferring ownership of the Riverside Lofts to a property management company. I was done playing landlord. I was done orchestrating other people's consequences. It was time to focus on my own life, my own future, my own happiness. 2 weeks later, I moved into Uncle Harold's mansion on the lake. It was too big for one person, but it was beautiful and peaceful, with gardens that needed tending and rooms that needed living in. I hired a housekeeper named Maria who taught me to cook authentic Mexican food. I bought a dog, a golden retriever named Charlie, who'd been abandoned at the animal shelter and needed a second chance. I learned to paint watercolors and took piano lessons and joined a book club with women my age who'd lived full, complicated lives and had interesting stories to share. I traveled to places I'd only read about, Italy, Greece, Scotland, and discovered that the world was full of beauty and kindness when you had the resources to access it safely. 6 months later, I received a letter from Winston. He and Aviana had separated, not bitterly, but quietly. Both of them acknowledging that their relationship had been built on shallow foundations that couldn't survive real hardship. Winston was still working at the telemarketing company, but he'd been promoted to supervisor and was taking business classes at night. Aviana had moved back in with her parents and was training to become a physical therapist, a more stable career that would let her help people without requiring them to pay for private yoga sessions. "I think about that night often," Winston wrote. "Not just because of what we did to you, but because of who I was that night. I was a coward and a follower, someone who let others make his moral decisions for him. I'm trying to become someone better, someone you could be proud of. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I'm trying." I wrote back, a short note telling him I was proud of him for trying, that character was built through choices made in difficult times, and that I loved him regardless of his mistakes. I didn't offer him money or invite him to visit, but I left the door open for a future relationship built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. A year later, we had lunch together at a small cafe near his apartment. He looked healthier, more confident, like a man who'd found his footing in the world. We talked about his work, his classes, his hopes for the future. We talked about my travels and my painting and Charlie the golden retriever. We didn't talk about the inheritance or the eviction or that night in the blizzard. We didn't need to. Those events had served their purpose, teaching lessons that needed to be learned and creating space for something new to grow. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to rescue them from the consequences of their choices. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to discover their own strength. As I drove home that afternoon, past the city where I'd struggled for so many years, toward the lake house where I was finally, truly at peace, I thought about Uncle Harold and his unexpected gift. He'd given me more than money. He'd given me the power to choose my own story, to decide how my life would end rather than simply enduring whatever others chose to give me. And in the end, I'd chosen forgiveness over bitterness, wisdom over revenge, and hope over despair. I'd chosen to use my inheritance not just to punish those who'd wronged me, but to teach them and myself about the kind of people we could choose to become. It had taken 64 years, but I'd finally learned that the most powerful inheritance isn't money or property. It's the understanding that you always have the power to choose who you want to be, how you want to treat others, and what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. And that knowledge, I realized, was worth more than $50 million. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.